Chapter 16 talks about population, urbanization, and the environment. So, one thing to think about that we hear in the public discourse, right, is that climate change isn't real. Or we'll hear people say, I'm entitled to my own opinion. So, one thing to think about is our attitudes, beliefs, facts about climate change, just our personal opinion. And this little chart here shows us a country by country breakdown of what percentage of people in those countries think global climate change is a major threat. So when we talk about demography, we're talking about studying populations, and the world's population began to spike around 1750. We add almost 81 million people to the planet each year. And in 2022, the population was 7.9 billion. I believe today it's a little over 8 billion. And demography refers to the study of the human population. Fertility refers to the incidence of childbearing in any particular society's population, whereas fecundity is the maximum possible childbearing. Now, that's sharply reduced by cultural norms, personal choice. Right? And then we also have the crude birth rate, which is the number of live births in any given year for every 1,000 people in a population. Now, the flip side of this is mortality, and that's the incidence of death in a country's population. The crude death rate is the number of deaths in any given year per 1,000 people. The infant mortality rate is the number of deaths amongst infants under 1 year of age. And life expectancy is the average lifespan of a country's population. And if you were to click on this link in our PowerPoints, you can see what life expectancy looks like across the world. So in general, right, it's around 73.3 years. For women, it's 76, and for men, it's just about 71. And you can also look at this on how it's changed over time, right? So life expectancy has been increasing over time. And then we can see a rank by countries as well. And you might think the United States was ranked pretty high, but it does not. We're down here at number 48. Now, a lot of these aren't super different, but the highest life expectancy is in Hong Kong, and it's about 10 years more than ours. Now, migration refers to people moving in and out of a defined territory or geography. So movement into a territory is immigration. That's a word we hear a lot here in the U.S. Movement out of a territory is emigration with an E. And the difference between them two is the net migration rate. Now, immigration and emigration could be voluntary or it could be involuntary. And here we can see how the population has been changing across the United States in the 2010s to 2020. You can see that population was moving from the rural heartland of the U.S. toward larger urban areas and the coasts. Now, population growth is affected by fertility, morality, migration. And when we estimate population growth, we're taking a society's population growth rate into the number 70, and that yields the doubling time in years. How many years it'll be before our population doubles in size. Now, when we look at the makeup of our population, one thing we might look at is the number of men to the number of women. And we might also look at age and sex of a population. So here we can see population age sex pyramids for the U.S. compared to Mexico, right? And so for the U.S., we can see that men are in blue and women are in this red and white stripe. And we can see what percentage of the population is within certain ages, right? So lower income nations tend to have a more pronounced pyramid shape because they have very high birth and very high death rates. And then high income nations have a more boxy shape because we have low birth rates and death rates. So it was estimated when these slides in this book was produced that we would pass 8 billion people in 2023, and we have. We're at 8.0, I want to say 3. The world is gaining 81 million people each year, and 99% of that increase takes place in lower income countries. Experts predict our population will reach 8.5 billion by 2030 and 9.7 billion by 2050. Now, Malthus predicted that these population increases would lead to chaos and calculated that the population would increase geometrically, right? But that our food production would only increase arithmetically, right? So geometrically meaning like it's not just, think of geometric progression as sort of like exponential and arithmetic progression as additive. And so Malthus was concerned that people would reproduce at rates exceeding our ability to produce sufficient food. But his predictions were flawed. People began to use birth control methods, right? We had a wide variety of birth control methods that were artificial that were available to us. We had increases and changes in technology that allowed us to produce more food. And the role of social inequality and world abundance and famine was also ignored. Now, democratic transition theory links population patterns to a society's level of technology, right? So pre-industrial, agrarian, there's high birth rates due to the economic value of children, right? Children have a value because they can work your farm, and we don't have birth control. Early industrial periods, we have high birth rates, and the death rate lowers, and that means our population grows. At mature industrial stage, population surge drops because affluence transforms children into an economic liability, right? People's children are not like working the farm, working in the family business, right? Children cost us money. Now, this theory suggests that the way we would control population lies in technology. And critics also argue that unless we redistribute global resources, the planet will increasingly become divided into people who have many, many resources and people who do not. So thinking about how our populations are changing and growing today, right? We have the northern hemisphere, right? Then this has zero population growth, right? It's a rate of reproduction that maintains the population, right? So not as much population growth in the northern hemisphere. Southern hemisphere, high population growth. It's a critical problem. You also have a growth of cities, right? And this begins as cities first start developing in, late 1700s, early 1800s. And urbanization refers to the idea that populations are concentrating in cities, okay? And it's redistributing the population within society. And this changes patterns of social life. So the first cities are in Jericho, north of the Dead Sea. We have pre-industrial European cities that date back 5,000 years to the Greeks and later the Romans. And here people are clustering together based on groups of occupations. And a lot of communities are defined by ethnicity. Then we have industrial European cities, and this begins as the Middle Ages ended. Cities grow and change shape. They start to focus on business. Then we have the settlement of colonies, right? Our first lasting settlement comes in New Amsterdam, which becomes New York in 1624. Starts out as these tiny villages, right? And some very wild or a vast wilderness. But at the time, only 5% of people lived in cities, right? 1800 to 1860, as I just mentioned, we start seeing urban expansion, right? We start seeing with industrialization and factories being built, we start seeing people moving to the city for jobs. Towns are springing up along routes that provide transportation. And now 1/5 of the population lives in the cities. Around 1860 to 1950, the Civil War boosts growth, and we start to see metropolises, all right? So that word probably might not be as familiar to you, but you've probably heard someone refer to an area as like a metropolitan area, right? Like the greater Boston metropolitan area. It's a large city that's socially and economically dominates an urban area. 1950 to the present, people are starting to kind of move out of cities a bit. They're going into outlying suburbs, and suburbs are urban areas beyond the political boundaries of like a main city. And here we can just kind of see how urban population has changed in the U.S. from 1790 all the way through projected numbers for 2050. By the end of the last century, 1900s, most Americans are living in suburbs. They're shopping at local malls. Although today, if you go to most local malls, right, there's a lot of abandoned storefronts in there. There's a lot of storefronts that aren't open for the full hours that the mall are open. We start seeing snowbelt cities losing higher income taxpayers to the suburbs, and some cities are falling into financial crises. In the 70s and 80s, inner cities become synonymous with things like the crack epidemic, unemployment, poverty, drugs. And the decline of central cities leads to a decline in the importance of public space. And after this urban decentralization occurs, right, now we see people moving to this post-industrial Sunbelt cities, right? So people are moving to southern areas in great rates. My parents moved outside of Tampa, Florida in 2004, and they moved into an area that had been recently developed, and prior to that had been like just sprawling farmland. And that area has grown exponentially. And there's a lot of what they call snowbirds down there. And those are people who, as they got older, or they decided like they didn't want to be in a snowy area anymore, have moved from like the north down to the south. So where my parents live, even though it's in Florida and it's a southern area, there's actually a lot of northern transplants there. This means there's been growth that's happened that's been unplanned, right? A lot of traffic. Sometimes the housing isn't planned well. Schools get overwhelmed. So in the area where my parents live, they've had to build a lot of schools. They live in an area that has a lot of planned housing. It's mostly major developments. But the growth has been exponential. And many people who've lived there their whole lives will talk about how it used to take them 10 minutes to get from point A to point B, and now it takes 20 or 30 minutes because there used to be nothing there. And now there's houses and school buses and schools. Now, another concept is this megalopolis, right? And this is urban areas containing a number of cities and their surrounding suburbs. And this happens with urban decentralization. So in the census, we have all these different areas where they do analysis of data. So we have metropolitan statistical areas. That's like, greater Boston. There's micropolitan statistical areas. There's combined statistical areas. We've also seen the development of what's called edge cities. These are business centers that are some distance from former downtowns, office buildings, malls, hotels, entertainment complexes, and many don't have clear physical boundaries. Rural areas kind of saw a rebound in the 1990s as people were moving from cities out into rural areas, but that pattern started to fade about 10, 15 years ago, and now typically what's in a rural area is an older population. So what does urbanization mean for our type of life, right? So one sociologist developed these two concepts, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce because they're German, right? First one, okay, I'll attempt. Looks like Gemeinschaft. It's a social organization in which people are closely tied by kinship and tradition. And Gesellschaft, social organization where people are together only on the basis of individual self-interest. Now, Durkheim, we've talked about him before. Durkheim, his big theory, he's the structural functionalist, and he also talks about anomie, a sense of normlessness. And he saw a difference in social organization. He thought urbanites organize their social life differently than people who live in rural areas. So you might have bonds that are based on common sentiments and shared moral values, and he calls that mechanical solidarity. Or you might have social bonds based on specialization and interdependence, which is a more organic type of solidarity. Now, George Simmel looks at cities and looks at a microanalysis of them. And he says, individuals see the city as a crush of people, objects, and events. And to prevent from becoming overwhelmed, if you think about, if you've been in a major city, which all of you have because you're here in Boston, right? But if you've been in a place like New York, which is even bigger and more crowded, right? The city it's a lot of noise. It's a lot of people. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of stimulus, right? And so to prevent from being overwhelmed, Simmel says people who live in cities basically develop a blasé attitude and tune out much of what goes on around them. Now, the Chicago School of Thought is interesting. It's actually a school of thought that develops out of the University of Chicago, their sociology department. And Park is kind of really well known in crim circles for talking about urban ecology and how cities are organized. And he said that cities are organized according to this like concentric zone theory. So in the center, you've got like your industry, your business, right? And then you sort of have mixed use areas where there's business and residential, and you move out into the suburbs and it's mostly just residential. And this has been expanded upon for those of you that are, CJ majors or minors. It's been expanded upon to look at that theory in terms of how that might affect crime rates. Now, Worth defines a city as a setting with a large, dense, socially diverse population. And this means that life in cities is impersonal, it's superficial. That sounds kind of negative, but if you think about it, think about the time we spend in our city here in Boston, right? We're moving around. We're passing so many strangers every day, especially those of you that are like commuting to campus on public transportation, right? And that is impersonal, as opposed to if you live in a small town and even when you run errands, you run into people you know and everybody knows your business. Now, some criticisms of this school of thought, right? These paint urbanism in broad strokes, right? It's kind of leaving out what role does class play or race or gender. Now, urban ecology is a study, as I mentioned, Park actually probably really belongs under this category. It's the study of the physical and social dimensions of cities. So it's taking the concept of ecology and basically applying it to cities. So they study the physical design of cities. So Burgess talked about that concentric zone theory. He did that work with Park. That's that like businesses are in the center, and as you get further out, it's less industrial, more residential. Right, and they talked about different ways that cities are designed. Now, there's also something to think about as a political economy in an urban area, right? So this takes Marx's analysis of conflict in the workplace and basically applies it to a city and says that city life is defined by large institutional structures, one of which is capitalism, right? And we talked about this when we've talked about this in class a few times, right? And capitalism, especially here in the U.S., is kind of the key to understanding urban life. It takes cities and transforms them to real estate, right, that gets traded for profit, concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a few. Now, some evaluations or criticisms of this. The political economy model over the urban ecology tends to fit our current society a little bit more. Our cities aren't necessarily arranged in these concentric zones, but both are really limited in terms of they really only apply to specific historical errors. Now, what does urbanization look like in poorer nations? So in 2008, the world as a whole becomes mostly urban, with 80% of people living in cities. Urban growth happens very quickly in low-income nations, and many poor nations have entered that high growth stage 2 of that transition we talked about a few slides ago. Cities offer more opportunities, but we don't have quick fixes for the problems that come with growing our population very quickly. Now, what about the environment? Ecology is the study of the interaction of living organisms in our natural environment, which is the Earth's surface, atmosphere, living organisms, air, water, soil, and other resources that sustain life. So one thing to think about is an environmental deficit, right? What is the profound long-term harm to the natural environment caused by our focus on short-term gains and short-term material affluence? This is important for a few reasons, right? One is it reminds us that environmental concerns are sociological, right? It's not just like natural and scientific. Sociology helps shape that. Why are we in a position with such extreme climate change? That's because of human decisions, okay? So when I was growing up, there was this concern over this hole in the ozone layer. It turned out these chemicals called CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, they were in a lot of like spray aerosol bottles, were damaging the ozone. And we cut back on those. And so the hole in the ozone has gotten smaller, right? But you guys have seen enough climate change in your lifetime to know that this is something that's happening, right? So it's currently November 2024 as I'm recording this, and it's been in 50 degrees, right? Most of us have not worn a winter jacket yet, and that's generally not normal for this time of year. It also suggests for us this concept that environmental damage is unintended, and maybe in some ways it means it's reversible. So when we think about growth, right, we think about our technology, we think about technology as being something that's improved our lives, and we assume that we'll have new discoveries that will do so in the future. But progress can lead to unexpected problems, right? It creates a strain on the environment. And the logic of growth argues that people will find a way out of any problem that growth places in our path. But environmentalists are like, hey, that's kind of some flawed logic there, right? Growth has to have limits, right? We have to have policies in place. If you think about how much stuff you throw away in the trash, right, and how much of that is stuff we could probably be recycling, or even the programs we have in place to recycle, and then you see these documentaries where most of our recycling ends up as trash in like China or other countries. Right? We consume more products than pretty much any other country. We generate about 1.6 billion pounds of solid waste every day. And you can kind of see a breakdown of that here, right? So paper is almost a quarter of that. And food, those are both things, right? Paper we can recycle, food we could compost, yard trimmings could compost, right? We have to be thinking about some of our single-use stuff, right? Like our single-use plastics. Less than 1% of the Earth's water is suitable for drinking, and that is a concern. It's a concern in a lot of Northern America and Asia. Water quality in the U.S. is generally good by global standards, but our rivers and streams are absorbing so much toxic waste every year. I don't know if acid rain is a thing you guys learned about in school. I remember learning about it in high school and it being talked about a lot more. And that was how the rain was starting to have this acidic quality as a result of air pollution. We have made a lot of improvements in air pollution. I remember growing up seeing smokestacks kind of everywhere, and there was smoke in the air all the time, and we don't really see that as much anymore. Rainforests are regions of dense forestation, most of which circles the globe near the equator, right? South America, Brazil has a large rainforest, but they're falling victims to the needs and appetites of the world population. They're being lost to, deforestation, and now they're less than half their original size. We also just touched a little bit upon global climate change, right? And the result of that is global warming. So when people talk about global warming, and then some critics are like, but it's cold out today, they mean the average annual temperature of the Earth, okay? And that Earth's average temperature has been rising because we have an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Scientists are in complete agreement on this. Climate change is real. It's a result from human activity. There's crap we need to do about it. We have so many species of animals, plants, microorganisms, right? But biodiversity is decreasing, right? This is important because it provides us a wide variety of food. It's a genetic resource, right? We know that it's the source of medicines and skincare, right? And if we have species go extinct, that's it. They're gone forever. We can't do anything about that. There's also some concepts that might sound, unfamiliar to you, like environmental racism and environmental sexism, but they're pretty much what they sound like, right? So environmental racism is how development happens in our environments that disproportionately impacts poor people, especially people of color, right? To environmental hazards. Like if you have to build, a new factory, where are you building it, right? And then there's also environmental sexism. So those are patterns that place girls and women at disadvantages. So how do we move towards a more sustainable society, right? Sustainability and ecological sustainable cultures is a way of life that meets the needs of our current generation without threatening the future generation. So we need to bring population growth under control. We need to reduce waste, and we have to conserve our resources that are limited, right? Not all of our resources are infinite. We need to think about strategies for that, right? And so we could do this egocentrically, right? Where we think about like, what do I want? What do I want my standard of living to look like? Or we could do it ecocentrically, thinking about how the choices we make shape the world for everybody. And finally, climate change is a political issue. It shouldn't be, right? Though science is science, right? Conservatives embrace the logic of growth. They believe whatever challenges come our way, we'll find a way to get around them, right? We have in the past, that'll just continue in the future. And so the government doesn't need to enact any rules or quote unquote radical agendas. Progressives are like, hey, there's limits to growth and climate change is real and we need to partner to think about our future.